Okay, welcome back. I'm very excited about this panel, someone who's interested in memory. So this panel is Authoritarianism and the Struggle for the Past. We've got two credible speakers here this morning, and I'm going to introduce them before passing the mic off to y'all. So our first speaker today is Amy Sodaro, who is a professor of sociology from the City University of New York. We really have some New York representation this year in our presenters, and I love it. And New Jersey, not forgetting about UK. Borough of Manhattan Community College. Her research focuses on memorialization of past violence in memorial museums. She's the author of Lifting the Shadow, Reshaping Memory, Race, and Slavery in U.S. Museums in 2025. Exhibiting Atrocity, Memorial Museums and the Politics of Past Violence, 2018. And is a co-editor of Museums and Sites of Persuasion, Politics, Memory, and Human Rights, 2019. Museums and Mass Violence, 2025. And she is a faculty member with the Genocide Human Rights University program at the Zoryan Institute. So we got double Zoryan representation up here. And then Henry Theriault, who's I gave Kate her flowers earlier today. You get some too, Henry, because Henry has been at this conference from its inception and has shown up in so many ways and asked lots of questions. But, you know, both Kate and Henry really go over and above, you know, with their work towards this conference as people from outside Arizona, like the moderating and just being available. Like I've leaned into both of you a lot, and I just want to say I appreciate you both.
Thank you.
So now the formal introduction. So Henry is an Associate Provost at Worcester State University in Massachusetts. These are two of my most challenging words to pronounce. Where are you from? So where he previously taught in the philosophy department from 1998 to 2017, his research and teaching specializes in genocide studies, specifically denial, reparations, victim-perpetrator relations, prevention, and mass violence against women and girls. He has spoken, and many times here, including, and published widely on these topics, and he's the author. He's also an editor of Genocide Studies International and is a faculty member with the Genocide and Human Rights University program at Zoryan Institute. So, Amy, I'll pass it over to you. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming today. So as Tim said, my research is on memorialization, specifically in memorial museums, which are created as a way to confront past violence with the goal of creating a better present and future. But they are also often spaces of political contestation. And so I'm going to be talking today about the contemporary struggle over the past in the United States, in American museums and memorials, specifically over the historical memory of slavery. And I don't know if any of you recognize what this image is here, but this is the removal of panels on slavery from the President's House site in Philadelphia, which I'll mention in my talk. So my past research has focused on tracing the emergence of memorial museums, which came out of Holocaust commemoration and spread around the globe as a new form of commemoration that's used to come to terms with a violent past. I believe they're born out of what Jeffrey Olick has termed a politics of regret, and we're part of a larger kind of general shift toward trying to atone for the wrongs of the past. In many ways, I think memorial museums and this larger politics of regret were kind of intended to serve as a corrective for authoritarian control over the past and historical narratives, such as we saw in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Though certainly in some cases of museums I've worked on, like in Hungary and in Rwanda, the memorial museum form has been kind of co-opted by authoritarian regimes to impart their particular historical memory of the past. And so if anyone's interested in like specific case studies like those, we can talk about them in the Q&A. In the US, we've been very quick to remember the atrocities committed by others vis-a-vis the politics of regret. So we have lots of Holocaust museums, we have the 9/11 Museum, but we've been much slower to remember and commemorate violence that has been perpetrated by the United States. But this has begun to change over the last decade, and the politics of memory have really kind of collided around the issue of race in the United States, with slavery and its legacies at the center of kind of these big mnemonic struggles that I'll be focusing on. And I just want to pause and say that many of us who research memory and memorialization have looked with interest at other countries and contexts to understand authoritarian efforts to control narratives of the past. So we've looked at places like China and Russia and Rwanda and Hungary and Poland. But today we're seeing these kind of efforts unfolding like right before our eyes in this country, particularly around the memory of slavery. So I'm kind of not talking specifically about genocide, but focusing on, mnemonic struggles in the US today. So it is a critical moment for thinking about the history and memory of slavery in the United States. On the one hand, we have seen what Jeff Olick has described as a mnemonic turn in the United States, which has been kind of a wave of memory activism around slavery. We've seen the toppling of Confederate monuments. We've seen universities confronting their own ties to slavery. We've seen investigations like the 1619 Project that try to reorient our founding myths in this country. We've seen grassroots movements. This is an example of the Slavers of New York sticker campaign, putting up stickers all over the city to kind of remind people of where these names of our streets and subway stations come from. And of course, in 2020, we saw the global wave of Black Lives Matter protests that has, in the words of Jeff Olick, put America's unmastered past at the top of national attention in a way it has not been since Reconstruction. And sorry, there are my little references here to what you see. However, these efforts to right the wrongs of the past have been met by sharp backlash. And so, we see everything from a kind of surge in white supremacy movements that was really epitomized by the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, but we've seen it kind of all over the country since, to efforts to ban critical race theory in schools, which we were just talking about happening in this state, to the January 6th attack on the Capitol in 2021, which had serious racist undertones, to what appear to be openly racist gestures and actions by some of the most powerful people connected to the current administration. And so many people had thought that in 2008, when Obama was elected, that had ushered in this new post-racial society. But it quickly became clear that this was just a myth. And today we're kind of embroiled in what Alison Landsberg has described as a post-racial period, where the issue of race has become really central to our discourses. So these battles are being, purportedly fought over the past and its memory, but they're really actually about the present and future. And we see on the one hand, these efforts to kind of maintain this long silence around slavery in a way that upholds the patriarchal white supremacist structures that are a foundation to our society. And on the other, we see these efforts to end the silence in the hope that engaging in a more critical and truthful history telling will help heal the wounds of the past and contribute to a more inclusive and just present and future. And so this truth-telling function is particularly important vis-a-vis the memory and history of slavery in the US. And this is a quote from Brian Stevenson, who is the director of the Equal Justice Initiative. And I'll be talking just really briefly about their memorial museum in a little bit, but his ideas really I think, help us think about and structure our thoughts about how we are confronting the memory of slavery. So this truth-telling function is very important in the kind of institutions that I'm going to be talking about today. The US has more than 300 African-American history and culture museums, but most of them have tended to tell a kind of uplifting story of racial progress. Most have focused on celebrating the civil rights movement and glossing over the extreme violence of slavery. This is a plaque for an abandoned project for a National Museum of Slavery that was to be built in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and this is kind of what came of that project. By relegating slavery to history and to the past, U.S. museums have largely avoided confrontation with what Saidiya Hartman has called the afterlife of slavery, or the contemporary and ongoing impacts of slavery. And I think this quote here from the former mayor of Birmingham really sums up our attitude toward remembering slavery in this country. Kind of put it away in a museum and then we can forget about it. But this is changing. And so I'm now going to turn to just a few examples of some of these efforts to remember and confront the history and truth about slavery, looking at some institutions that are trying to reckon with this past. And then I'll move on to look at the Trump administration's responses to these efforts and what this mnemonic struggle looks like today. So one of the key early initiatives to commemorate slavery within this mnemonic turn in the US was the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. This is a place where an estimated 15,000 individuals from Africa or African descent were buried. And the burial ground was abandoned at the end of the 18th century and then kind of forgotten for about 200 years until the federal government was excavating to build a skyscraper on the site and came across human remains. Of course, the government wanted to just kind of keep it all quiet and keep building their building, but there was a lot of pushback from the community and pressure on the government to acknowledge and remember the site. And so a memorial was constructed and opened in 2007, and a small museum opened in 2010 that tell the history of the site, but also tell about slavery in New York and in the North, which was a really kind of hidden historical narrative that many people wish to forget, but that's now kind of being told out in the open. And like many other memorials and museums that were created within the politics of regret, the African Burial Ground is a space of contemplation, peace, and memory, but it's also a place for education and moral reckoning. Other national historical sites also began to incorporate stories of slavery, and this is the President's House site in Philadelphia. This is a house where George Washington and John Adams had lived when Philadelphia was very briefly the capital of the new nation. And the site opened in 2010 with an exhibit about, of course, the site and its history, but also about slavery and the role that slavery played in the founding of this nation, and about the individuals that George Washington had enslaved that lived in the house. And of course, many of you know the site has been in the news lately because the Trump administration ordered the panels on slavery to be removed from the site as part of this push toward the America 250 celebration that's coming. The panels were later restored by a judge's order, but this is one of these very prominent examples of this struggle over the past. As these national historic sites were beginning to recognize and reckon with the history and memory of slavery, universities began to do the same. And so we saw universities in the South and in the Northeast begin to confront their own histories of and connections to slavery, creating commissions and study groups to really look into their ties to slavery. And creating memorials. And these are just a couple from Brown University in the your left-hand corner, and University of Virginia in the upper right-hand corner. And as came up yesterday, even some plantations are beginning to confront the historical memory of slavery. And the most notable is the Whitney Plantation, which really centers the enslaved at the site. There are restored slave cabins and artifacts that are associated with slavery. And there's a lot of memorialization. So there are these terracotta sculptures of children that are kind of scattered throughout the site. There are these memorial walls that name individuals who were enslaved at the site and in Louisiana. And the goal of the Whitney is to try to sort of transform visitors through these affective encounters with the history of slavery and to challenge hegemonic American histories in what are kind of really radical ways. And there are also a couple of new prominent museums that more critically and truthfully address slavery and its legacies. And this is really where my research focuses. So if you have questions about these museums, I'm happy to go deeper into them because I'm just going to say a little bit right now. And so one of these is the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened in 2016 on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And it took 100 years to build this museum, basically a century of trying to figure out whose story deserves to be told on the National Mall. The museum has really extensive exhibits on slavery and segregation. And kind of the focus of the historical exhibition of the exhibit is this paradox of a nation that is founded on the idea of freedom, while also, this institution of slavery. So the museum confronts slavery and segregation in really painstaking historical detail. The historical exhibition spans 3 floors of exhibition space, and it really centers slavery and race in the American story. And its mission, as I have put here in the corner, is to tell the unvarnished truth about African American history. And it really explicitly tries to link truth-telling about the past to contemporary reconciliation and repair. Similarly, just a year and a half later, after the Smithsonian Museum opened, the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration opened in Montgomery, Alabama, together with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is pictured here in the bottom left-hand corner, which came up in yesterday's discussion. And these institutions were created by the Equal Justice Initiative, which is led by the lawyer activist Bryan Stevenson. And they were really opened, they were created with the intent to tell the historical truth about slavery and lynching and segregation, and to kind of help situate the legal advocacy that EJI does in contemporary Alabama within this longer history of racial injustice in the United States. And the mission of these sites, and I'm quoting here from EJI's website, was to be an engine for education about the legacy of racial inequality and for the truth and reconciliation that leads to real solutions to contemporary problems. The museum goes even further than the Smithsonian Museum to center race in American history and to connect past and present. And it makes the argument that slavery did not end, that instead it evolved into today's system of mass incarceration. And I know Michelle Alexander was mentioned yesterday, and so this is like her argument that is put into museological form. So in their effort to tell the truth about slavery and its ongoing legacies, these memorials and museums challenge the dominant narratives of racial progress, and they place racial oppression at the center of American history, and they link historical slavery to contemporary racial injustice. And in this effort to kind of set the historical record straight, they're not just about historical truth-telling, but they're trying to drive social transformation in the present. But it is precisely this kind of truth-telling as a basis for social transformation that is under attack today by the Trump administration. So in March 2025, Trump issued an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History that is aimed at rooting out corrosive ideology in the Smithsonian institutions and other federal sites of history and memory. And it accuses sites like the National Museum of African American History and Culture of making a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history in a way that deepens societal divides and fosters a sense of national shame. A few months later, Trump ordered a comprehensive review of 8 Smithsonian museums, complaining on Truth Social that the Smithsonian focuses too much on how bad slavery was, and calling museums the last remaining segment of woke. These declarations are part of the Trump administration's larger project of eliminating efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we talked about this a fair amount yesterday. These efforts have included banning books and revising curricula, canceling federal funding for institutions and projects touching on related topics, scrubbing websites of content related to DEI and removing information from national historic sites, such as the President's House site in Philly, renaming military bases for Confederate soldiers and reinstalling Confederate monuments, canceling free entry at national parks on Martin Luther King Day and Juneteenth, and replacing them with Trump's birthday, among many other efforts. And while these efforts are intended, or while many of the administration's efforts are intended to kind of wrest control over institutions, agencies, and sectors of society in the present, this work is also obviously aimed at controlling historical narratives, and the administration is framing these efforts in terms of truth. In its effort, or in the efforts of the museums and memorials, I think this is where I am. In the efforts of the museums and memorials to engage in truth-telling around slavery and other aspects of difficult history, this is what the Trump administration is vehemently fighting against in its effort to create its own truth about American history. And so Michel Foucault has argued that each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourses it accepts and makes function as true. So in the kind of museums I was just looking at, when the factual truth and the historical truth that is presented in these sites does not comport with the image of past and present that the regime wishes to present, the Trump administration is instead pressuring these institutions to present a specious history of America in terms of what they call its unparalleled legacy of advancing liberty, individual rights, and human happiness. So by co-opting and turning on its head the very notion of truth, the Trump administration is trying to undermine the kind of historical truth-telling work that these museums and institutions are trying to engage in, because they represent a threat to the administration's efforts to construct his own regime of truth. And I would argue that Trump does not simply want to control the narrative of public history, he wants to control truth itself. I think a key pillar of his populism is his claim to having a kind of special relationship to the truth. I mean, his social media site is called Truth Social. And his efforts to control historical memory echo Stuart Hall's claim following Foucault that knowledge linked to power not only assumes the authority of the truth, but has the power to make itself true. So Trump is asserting his power in the effort to make true a whitewashed history of the American past. However, I think, and this is where I get a little bit hopeful, that this attack on museums also points toward their power in presenting and circulating the unvarnished truth about this past. In their efforts at historical revisionism, Trump and his administration reveal not only their fear of this truth, but especially its circulation in public institutions of history and memory. And perhaps they should be afraid, as they're busy restricting what books can be read and what can be taught in history classes. Museums are becoming even more important educational spaces. And they're also really popular. So even red states like Texas and Florida are putting money into creating African-American history museums because they want to attract tourist revenue and they know people will come. I think the public outcry, and this is an image from that, over the removal of the panels at the President's House site in Philadelphia was a really excellent reminder that Americans want to know this history. And a recent Pew study found that a majority of Americans think it's important to not only learn about historical successes in institutions like these, but also about historical failures. And so while Trump can and probably will withhold federal funds to force historical whitewashing in many of our institutions, museums like the Legacy Museum that I touched on, which is totally private and doesn't rely on any public funding, will be able to continue telling this truth about the past and history. And I think the overall message of hope that I can leave us with today is that it might not be as easy to whitewash the past as the administration thinks. For the truth about the past is already in circulation, and many people want to know this truth. And I'll just end with James Baldwin, who we also talked about yesterday, who reminds us of this in these words that adorn the walls of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it. History is literally present in all that we do. Thank you.
All right, dang, I have to follow that, which is not going to be fun after a whole week of amazing presentations. So anyway, thank you all for being here after a kind of marathon 3.5 days so far. I'm going to very much encourage you to keep coming today as much as you can because there's great stuff all through the day. I want to thank Tim and others who are the organizers of this because, and Alex, yes, I'm sorry. Sorry. Who have worked tirelessly to put this together, which in my opinion has been one of the most sophisticated engagements of genocide that I've been present at, and I'm, for better or worse, present at a lot of them in the last few years. So I think it's a really important testament, and I know the things we'll see later today will only add to that. So anyway, I'm probably not going to actually stay on that topic, but I'm going to try somewhat. When I think of authoritarianism, I'm automatically also thinking of democracy and the myths about democracy that we carry with us. And in very simple terms, we've been talking a lot about authoritarianism versus democracy. Unfortunately, if you look, for instance, at US foreign policy, authoritarian or anti-democratic really truly means not aligned with US policy interests. And democratic truly means aligned with US policy interests. So you can go, and we had a great student presentation on Guatemala, and during the genocide that was presented as a, democracy and so forth, even though it was a situation where it was a genocidal regime. And that's just one example. Not to say, and I would argue, sometimes we're right that when people are not aligned with, or a country is not aligned with the US, it is authoritarian, but it's not dependent on, our view of what's democratic and not is not actually dependent on any facts of the matter. In domestic usage, I think it's actually even worse in the way that we use these terms. They're generally very vague, and they're unstable. So when we talk about democracy, what it means to different people and what it means over time within different contexts shifts quite a bit. And it really depends on the sort of political forces, social forces, cultural forces, and so forth that are operating, right? So Amy had that great quote about the paradox of liberty and slavery, right? I don't think it's a paradox, actually. I think it's fundamental to democracy. I'll get to that in a second. But that kind of shows us how we can talk about something as a democracy, but what that means is really something different from what we might think it means or what we're claiming. And particularly when we give it an ethical valuation as part of our designation. So I would say a lot of stuff sort of creeps in, particularly in US discourse, but in other cases. One of the presentations was excellent on Tuesday, basically assumed, quote unquote, liberalism was the antidote to mass violence and authoritarianism and so forth. I would argue quite differently that liberalism is a big part of why democracies are problematic and can produce authoritarian structures within democracies, which I'll get to in a second as well. Anyway, there are a lot of different ways. I just add this as an illustration. There are a lot of different ways of thinking of these terms, a lot of different dimensions. And this is important because we often think of things as a political system, but there's a culture of inclusion and exclusion that might be more important to democracies, and I think it is, than the formal political structures. There are economic and other dimensions. That's why liberalism or liberal capitalism can be very problematic for democracies because it tends to produce hierarchies even within a formally formal legal structure that appears to be guaranteeing equality among participants in that society. And the definitions, I think, often are reductive and assumptive, and those, including Dirk, who have done a lot of work on the meaning of the term genocide, would, I think, agree that it's similar to genocide in that respect, that we operate with a lot of simplistic ideas. All right. Okay, you're on the next slide, I think, but you'll appreciate why in a second. So the question I have to ask is, are we really talking about authoritarianism versus democracy or something else? And I don't see them as opposed systems or formations. Democracy is more or less a default. I mean, these are typical ideas about what a democracy is: voting, electoral democracy, voting participation, rule of law applied equally to all citizens, and then the idea of civil or human rights being sort of guaranteed within a society. As I mentioned, there can be democratic culture and attitudes that go beyond the structures. But no matter what, I see democracy as underdetermined. What does that mean? That's an old, not that old Marxist economics term. And it really means that democracy in itself does not necessarily produce good results or bad results. It's always a structure that can be used and exploited. And a lot of the discussion so far this week has focused on the use of democratically developed legal structures for mass violence, as tools of mass violence. And so, and I'll get to this a little bit further, and I think one of the big failures, and I'm very focused on the US these days, partly to avoid the long-range liberalism that you talked about, where genocide is always somebody else's problem and of course never ours. But if we start to think about what the US system is built on, it was actually intended to a large degree to be independent of individual ethical positions within the society, right? And that was a great idea. Actually, I'm not disparaging it. It was a great idea to think people kind of suck, right? I mean, that's the reality, right? And they will mess up even the best things that you build and produce. But the idea is, okay, they tried to create a system that it would be very hard to do that, right? So you have a bad president, and then you have a Congress and a judiciary that will be a check on them and balance out that power and so forth, right? Because they didn't trust anyone. They were right. They were influenced enough by Hobbes to understand how people operate politically. The problem is the structure can't do that. I'll refer to Renan a little bit later, but just to think of Renan's idea of a nation, but really about a society, Ernst Renan, 1882, What is a Nation? Really talks about the fact that a nation is recreated in every single moment or by a daily plebiscite. And there's actually people really want to get into philosophy, there's a part of the Meditations by Descartes where he talks about the universe needing to be caused by God in every moment. There is no inertia of existence. And that's actually a good idea, right? And I think that that's where we fall down a lot in the United States and in other societies, where we step back and think the system will just continue to function regardless of how we operate within it. Authoritarianism can be and often is a system, don't get me wrong. And I would say, and other people have said this already this week, and of course this is nothing new, when a structure of democracy, a political structure, gives way or is put aside in favor of a formally legalized dictatorship, oligarchy, plutocracy, broligarchy, which we have now, and so forth. The rule of law, again, is a similar kind of thing, right? A legal system is not in itself a good thing or a bad thing. And if you set up a legal system that's authoritarian, the outcome is bad, right? I mean, pretty basic, pretty simple. Authoritarianism can also mean something a little bit subtler. And that's the way that democracy is actually instantiated in the world. And of course, there are many systems of government. I'm being very crude here and just talking about democracy and authoritarianism. In that sense, authoritarianism doesn't displace democracy, but uses it and functions within it. And I would actually characterize such things as authoritarian democracies, right? Where the democratic structures themselves contribute to hierarchies of the type that actually result in mass violence, oppression, and so on. All right, let's go a little bit further. Okay, you'll see the note to Kate, I win. This is the worst slide ever. Sorry, I see. There are too many words here. I'm sorry. I'm like a philosophy guy, and I can't do social media. I can't do PowerPoints. It's a nod to people. It's the best I can do. But I will say that, you know, a lot of people get this wrong. They believe that authoritarianism replaces democracy and fail to differentiate between formal authoritarianism and structure or outcomes of a democracy that are authoritarian. And so there are reasons for this. One of the things I would argue, and this is following Robert John Ackerman, philosopher Robert John Ackerman, who bases this on John Stuart Mill. And if you read the introduction to John Stuart Mill, you see it. One of the most beacons of free speech and democratic equality, attacked the tyranny of the majority, was all for individual rights. But what does he do right in the introduction? He excludes Indians, Chinese, and other colonized people across the world. Like 80+% of humanity couldn't be part of a democracy, right? And I would argue that democratic community always depends on an external other, okay? If you look at the United States today, right, what are our external others? There are actually two that are biggest ideologically, and you see this again and again, you know, in different societies that commit mass violence and in other ways. There are often a couple key groups that they target. Anybody want to? Immigrants. Excellent. That I'm very impressed. Like, yes, those are the two. Trans especially right now. The rhetoric against them is extreme, genocidal, and it's very clear that we define ourselves as not them. And so that's a kind of negative, weak kind of community, right? And we've talked a little bit about this. Jim Waller, I think, did a great job, and I think there have been some others that have talked about this week, about what it means to build genuine community versus this kind of community. Unfortunately, this is where this is a problem of democracy. And I would add that when you introduce capitalism and sort of liberal individualism, right, things like that tend to break down community relations and actually tend to function anti-ethically, you are almost inevitably going to find a growing power disparity within a society. And that's where we start to see that you can have democratic functioning with authoritarian exclusions, violence, and so forth. And I'm talking internally here. It gets even worse if you look externally, right? Samantha Powers, since I'm going to talk about denial, don't worry, I'm going to get there. Samantha Powers' book, which was mentioned last time, A Problem from Hell, on the one hand is a really nice record of some U.S. foreign policy issues, and if you want to study U.S. foreign policy, it's a great thing. It's also one of the great denialist texts of the 21st century. It is foundationally about the exclusion of U.S. perpetration of genocide from the founding of the country all the way through. You don't see Native Americans anywhere. She has one sentence on Native Americans, and it's a throwaway that doesn't recognize them in any way. You don't see Guatemala. You don't, I mean, on and on and on, right? And so that gets to the next point. This is where we start to get into denial. Get to this in a second. So I would actually say in some ways, democracy can be a risk factor for genocide. That is that it's incorrect, and we do this. And by the way, Leah Greenfeld's 1992 Nationalism's 5 Paths to Modernity is another great denial text. She was very famous at the time, teaching at Harvard and so forth. Great denial text, picking up what Amy was talking about, because in it, she actually, I'm not joking about this, it's post-Cold War, she argues that slavery was a communist plot and not part of the reality of U.S. principles. I can explain. She actually is talking about she turns it into agrarian socialism, which Marx and Engels specifically reject as communism, say that that's not it, but that she's not worried about that stuff. And so as we're looking at this, I think it's incorrect to say Trump is authoritarian. He's just damn good at manipulating democratic structures, legal structures. Yeah, would he like to get rid of all the law, and he does try, right? Put your birthday on this. It's legal for him to have his birthday on a national park sign. That's the reality. And that's the world that we have. We haven't thought about how to deal with that, right? And if enough people in the country go along with it, right? That old tyranny of the majority of John Stuart Mill had some good things to contribute. That's not anti-democratic at all. In fact, it's truly democratic, right? A popular majority. I do believe Nazi Germany eventually was not democratic, but it certainly started out as a democracy that Hitler and others were able to really manipulate effectively, right? And using things like fear even to legally suspend civil rights, right? Which sounds something like the Patriot Act, if I'm not mistaken, but that's another thing. Anyway, now I'm going to get to denial. I'm not a historian, so I just make up stuff about history pretty much. But it's a little bit like Baudrillard's discussion of how we think of reality through, getting up to the whole postmodern non-reality kind of thing. And we talked about this a little bit around Assyrian genocide and so forth. Ancient and early medieval leaders and so forth were happy to talk about genocide. In fact, there's evidence the Assyrians as one group bragged about genocides they didn't even commit because that was a way to intimidate enemies, right? Embrace your genocide. The Old Testament, there's no shame about genocides there, right? It's like, we're going for it. You get a slow transformation, this is very rough, 1000 to 1500, where you start to get at least religious justification. So think of the Inquisition, right? So heterodoxy under a Catholic rule in Europe becomes something that's targeted, right? Does that make sense? So there's now an ideological thing. Witch hunting, early witch hunting, not modern witch hunting, but witch hunting here, functions on an ideological principle. And that becomes really important because that's how we get to today. And then 15 to 1800, you start to have a rise of participatory societies, democracies, that kind of thing. You start to have evidence becoming a different issue, right? So you actually need scientific evidence for things, data, again, not perfectly, but it comes in. And that's where you get a sort of full ideological or full justificatory system, though not what we get later, not fully what we get. And this is not necessarily about proving that our ideology, our religion, whatever, is inherently, like we don't have evidence that it's inherently superior to others, but because it's ours, it's superior because we know we're superior or we're right? And so you see a lot of this kind of stuff. It's the basis of genocides of indigenous peoples in North South America, Australia, and so forth, and so on. This idea of this inherent hierarchy based on these fundamental elements of culture and belief and society and so forth. Believe it or not, denial really starts to happen in the 1800s. And John Stuart Mill is also really good there because he has a rationalization and denial of colonialism. He was a colonial administrator, actually, as his career, believe it or not. And in this point, we start to see not just a need to rationalize violence through ideological statements and so forth, but a need to square it with emerging human rights and civil rights principles. And that's where denial comes in because guess what? You can't do it, right? 19th century, people always say the 20th century was the bloodiest. I mean, the 19th century was every bit as bloody. And it was bloody in a way that was continually justified through sort of denialist approaches, rationalist approaches, and so forth. And that was actually not the killing, but the need for justification was actually a good thing because it told us that at least for the first time in history, people realized there were ethical imperatives that they were supposed to be living up to. And you actually talk about this as well. I mean, you talked about this as well. There was something, at least there were principles that we agreed we should, adhere to. Many groups, societies, governments, and so forth didn't want to adhere to them. And so what they did was started using denial, fabrication, manipulation of facts, and other justifications in order to allow them to deal with that contradiction. Okay? And that works externally with the rise of international law. It becomes crucial. The ability to deny mass violence becomes crucial in preventing the international law mechanisms from curtailing your right to do bad things throughout the world. And internally, in two ways. One is to justify suppression of dissent, but also to convince populations, remember, popular support now matters, to convince populations that what they're participating in or supporting is ethically okay. And so this becomes really significant. We are now entering a different period. From 2020 on, and I'm really dating it then, we are seeing something very different happening. And I give three examples: Azerbaijan and Turkey against Armenians, Israel against Gaza and other Palestinians, and the US against Iran, where we see repeated, blatant statements of the intent to exterminate groups, to destroy them in different ways, right? And actually the language a lot of times is similar. I've been asking myself, have we just basically lost 1,500 years of history and slow, painstaking progress in human rights? And that might be the case. I'm not sure. I'm kind of cynical at times. But what I've noticed is in this new kind of genocidal rhetoric, it's actually more of a hybrid of the different previous forms. Sometimes it uses this kind of religious superiority just because we're superior. Sometimes it uses sophisticated denial kinds of arguments, and it really depends on how those statements are met, right? One of the fun denial pieces that we're seeing, we see this especially with Trump, he didn't really mean it, or you can't take that seriously, that's just a negotiating tactic. I'm sorry, threats of genocide, like if you're negotiating for a job and you say to your boss, I'm going to kill you if you don't give me what I want in this job. That's not okay. What's that? I'm going to kill everyone. Or kill everyone, yeah. That's not okay. We agree, right? That's not okay. And so I think what's giving me pause right now is this shift and what it actually means. Because what it means is people can be blatant about the intent to commit genocide, but preserve denialist structures that make it much harder to confront them. Every time in these cases, people have been confronted by saying, my God, it's so hard to prove genocide, like where, Hitler or Young Turks, whatever, where do you see it? No, they didn't say, let's commit genocide, and now they're doing it. Wow, this is really easy to show as genocide. You get very impressive denial efforts to cover that up and to sidestep it. So I'm going to nod. I'll be very quick here. Key lessons for prevention. Am I like a minute or something? Okay. Oh, that's rare. Wow. Okay. Key lessons for prevention and transitional justice. And denial happens, by the way, I hate the denial is the last stage of genocide stuff. It happens before genocides. It happens during genocides. It happens after them. And many people I think Muge Gocek talks about this in the case of Turkey before the Armenian genocide, that you had to deny the oppression, the inequality, the attitudes, and so forth in order to enable later genocide. This is sort of foreshadowing a little bit, but if you really want to prevent or address genocide, you got to do a lot more than democratize. And this has been, I was involved in a lot of discussions around Turkey over the last maybe 20, 30 years, and there was a period where people were really saying, if we just democratize Turkey, we will solve the Armenian genocide problem, the Syrians, Greeks, everything will be set. And the reality is quite different. I would argue, and again, I said this before, democracy can actually be a risk factor for genocide. Not only does it allow communitarian hierarchies to develop within a society, but it masks them, presenting them as truly democratic, which makes them much harder to critique. And it also creates a system where the oppressive forces are less centralized, right? An authoritarian regime is easier to stop. So you get a kind of Hydra effect or whack-a-mole effect. And I will now finish on denial, addressing the problem. This is a nod to Jim Waller. In very simple terms, democracy is a neutral system. If you put crappy ethics in, you get mass violence at the other end, right? And that's proven again and again and again. It's underdetermined. If there isn't, and I'm somewhat of an ethicist, and I actually believe ethics can have an impact. And I'll also point out, don't forget, realpolitik or denial that you're doing something for ethical reasons, just saying it's just business, like the mafia guys say, is very much an ethical position. Don't be fooled by that. Really, there needs to be an ethical input. The problem is we learned from Plato in the Meno 2,400 years ago that you can't really educate people into ethical viewpoints. You can teach them about ethics, but you can't do that. I have a little thing on peace building, which sort of connects with some of what Jim said yesterday. But I would argue that you need to radically transform global culture and cultures, the terms of political participation, and so forth, based on the negative aspects of democracy, the potentials, which is really hard. I mean, we have a massive reconstruction need that's going to maybe be a next stage. I am not fit or competent to articulate what that political reality would be, but we'll see. I hope other people here will come up with it. Anyway, thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you to both of you. So much to say about both. I've got some questions and comments for Amy and Henry, like between democracy and authoritarianism, ancient genocides, and it was interesting too what you said with enslavement and communism, because I'm working on a paper right now. I've been teaching it, but I'm for the AAR, where American Academy of Religion, where there's we're looking at the 75th anniversary, we charge genocide, right? So even Lemkin himself, when he became a cold warrior, the man who coined the term genocide, right? He called Patterson and Robeson un-American, communist sympathizers, him becoming a cold warrior and absolutely dismissing we charge genocide, which I think I'd agree with William Shavis. That's actually a much stronger case.
Oh, it is. I agree.
So,
100%. Yeah.
Not going to get into that, but Amy, I wanted to ask you a question. This came up the other yesterday, actually. With education versus structures, right? So even if because we've talked about like that, we mandate some education, and it's usually it's Holocaust, but other genocides that happened over there while we try to simultaneously erase history here. And that's super interesting too about the red states, looking at how this can be financially lucrative. But Antoinette and Jessica yesterday said, monuments, those are performative for them, right? That we need structural change, because like when we're following the Michelle Alexander argument and looking at things structurally, like right now, over 300,000 Black women have lost their jobs since the Trump regime has taken office. That is structural. What does that do? Like, what does a monument do for that, right? So until like we have a reckoning with the structures, like how much are monuments and education going to change? And just even attacks on DEI, right? That white women have benefited the most from DEI, but yet we put that on a group of people who lose 300,000 jobs when they're structurally targeted. So, and I was going to ask your thought. Like, this is a long introduction to asking about what we saw at the UN on March 25th, right, with declaring the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement as the greatest crime against humanity, right? And what they were looking at was just not the numbers with the Middle Passage and what that looked like and enslavement, but just the structural spin-offs with colonialism and just like the ongoing afterlives, like the tentacles that come out of it. right? And then when we look at, again, who voted for it and who didn't, right? People who have experienced this versus, again, the more Western-centric approach that you were talking about, Henry, the old model, like just to tie these two together. So I guess in sum, what did you think about the UN vote, if you want to, or resolution, if you want to go there, and just, this returning to the conversation we we're having yesterday about like structures, monuments, and education. I'm not saying it just has to be one, but, I think monuments and education can be limited until like we have a reckoning with the actual structures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, in many ways, I think museums and I know museums and monuments are an easy way out. Like in the aftermath of violence, they're much easier than, monetary or material reparations, than, prosecutions, than like other forms, other like tools of transitional justice. And so I think they are often an easy way out. And I think that part of like the UN, like the vote on the UN declaration, I think it reveals a fear of like having to actually materially and structurally deal with these problems, and the countries that voted against it or that abstained don't want to have to materially and structurally deal with these problems. I will say, like, so I've been studying these kinds of museums for a long time now. And when I started out, I was very optimistic about what I thought they could do. And then I became very skeptical about their ability to do anything that they purported to do or wanted to do. But I didn't talk much about it, and it came up yesterday. I think the Montgomery sites maybe do offer like a little more hope in terms of what these institutions can do, because they're not kind of standalone institutions. They're part of the Equal Justice Initiative's larger body of activism. And so the EJI is doing legal advocacy, and they've expanded their work now to providing healthcare and feeding people. And so I think, they might be an example of where, memory and memory institutions can integrate with activism, but it's on a very small local level. And so I don't know that structurally that
yeah,
create the kind of change that obviously we would need.
I would say though, it creates a moral transform, like that's a moral grassroots, actual moral change rather than a kind of higher level sort of performative one. So I think there's a lot there. And I would add, we often construct in reparations discourse symbolic / educational reparations as in opposition to material reparations. The reality is they're only either pole is a reparative gesture or a reparative move when coupled with a sort of equivalent from the other side, right? So just paying people off doesn't mean anything unless there's a structure of acknowledgement and change and transformation of society and so forth. But also vice versa. I know, I'm thinking, okay, if you have a mural downtown in Phoenix for James Baldwin, why not also fund 50 scholarships for low-income African-American folks to come to ASU, something like that. And so to have it actually matter, because they're both important. So now people know why they're getting this. Like there's a historical injustice. It's not charity. But by the same token, that important symbolic moment is there's a genuineness to it, a sacrifice.
Right, I think I gave up my mic for a second. ASU is just very performative about this and didn't actually follow through with anything, but I'm not mic'd up anymore, so I can say that, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. It's two questions for Amy. Look, without downplaying or denying the attack on public museums, I did think about the possibility of letting museums off the hook, and in the context in particular of the artifacts, and the human remains that are held by museums or university-based cultural institutions. The case I'm most familiar with is the Humboldt Forum in Germany. And I wonder if without addressing that admittedly very complicated, or maybe that's not complicated, problem, there are limits on the possibility of museums as sites of honest engagement with the past. I commend anybody who's interested in this terrific German documentary, The Empty Grave, from last year about an attempt by a couple of Tanzanian families to recover the skulls of ancestors, one of which somehow ended up in private hands. I want to think about how that happened, and is now in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And then the second one it has to do with preemptive complicity. Politico reported last week that the Holocaust Museum has taken down material related to Jim Crow, and to my knowledge, the Trump hasn't targeted I mean, you know better than me, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, obviously he's gone after the Smithsonian big time, but not to my knowledge the Holocaust Museum.
He did.
He has. Okay.
Released a bunch of the board.
Oh, all right. So I'm behind the curve on that one.
No, but I mean, this is absolutely, I think this is part of the scary slippery slope, is that curators and museums are starting to self-censor.
Yeah.
Like they're not even going there, where, even like fairly, like museums that aren't under the spotlight, that, exhibits that wouldn't necessarily garner attention, they're already starting to pull back from those. And so I think that's a very real phenomenon that like points to like the bigger climate, and how, it's not even just these specific targeted institutions, but I think all of them are starting to go there. And I mean, you're absolutely right about museums. So museums are colonial institutions. Like they come out of the colonial project. Most of them are filled with colonial loot, and I mean, so there are activists and scholars who think we need to do away with museums entirely. And I think that's a really fair position, and I totally understand where people are coming from. But at the same time, museum is kind of the first place, people go to think about how to tell their stories, display these artifacts. The Benin bronzes, like the question about where they should be, I think is really telling in this way, because like they've created a museum to put them in, like following the Western colonial model, to put them in Benin. So, so I think it's like a kind of intractable problem that museums face.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Just to direct traffic.
Okay.
We got Lisa, Kyle, Chris, Bedros, Ariel. You've asked a number of questions. We'll get to you. I appreciate all your questions, but we'll kind of go around the board here. Actually, Lisa.
Okay. This is, I guess, for Amy, but so I used to live on Robert E. Lee Drive here in Phoenix, which is now called Cactus Flower Street. And so when they were lobbying to change the name of the street, it got me thinking a lot about, if we take down all of these offensive monuments, or what, I don't know, they're not really monuments, reminders, aren't we burying history with that? And is it worth it? I mean, I also think of like New England, because I lived in New England for a while, and like, every house that's built before 1800 has a plaque on the house that says, this is this. Why not do that with those kinds of streets and those kinds of monuments, to say like, yeah, Jefferson Davis did this and he's horrible, and and we should know that. Or Robert E. Lee, or even like Jefferson. Like, Jefferson gave us a lot, but he's problematic. So I don't know, as we've had these debates over the last however many years, I'm not sure where I land on it because I think that we're missing something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, and this is a huge debate, right? Like everybody's talking about this and what you do with these monuments and remnants. And there are all kinds of different ideas. Like in Budapest, I don't know if anybody's been, there's a statue park where all of the old communist statues have been relocated. And it's kind of like communist Disney World. And you go walk among these statues that were taken down. I think many people think that these monuments at least should be either removed and put in museums or like reinterpreted on the site. Street names, I think there are different debates around because in many cases, like street and school names, I think it can be very painful for people to, have to be in these spaces with these names and memories. But what many cities and places are doing, including like the Trump administration with an army base, and I'm forgetting the details of that. And I don't think it quite works with Robert E. Lee, but they're just finding other people with the same name to like rename the streets. So they're not offensive anymore, but they still have the name of the person who offends. And so that's like obviously like ducking the whole issue. So I mean, I think everyone's grappling with these, and I think what's important is for people to critically think about these aspects of our history, but how we get there.
Yeah, if I can add, I want to suggest something from Genocide Studies and Prevention, 2010, by a group of Argentine scholars, and Walter Del Rio is the lead author. And I'm suggesting that because I think other societies often have very sophisticated ways of dealing with this. They write about the demonumentalization movement in Argentina around indigenous people, particularly. And if you go Roca, we can talk about that thing. So I really recommend that. It's a very sophisticated analysis of both what on the ground people were doing, and also sort of how that plays into potential, long-term systemic change. I would also, if I could just follow up on your question, I wanted to make one comment, which is don't forget authoritarianism can be stupid. And authoritarianism, just like people can make bad decisions, and I don't want to dismiss the damage that Trump is doing. But it's sort of the damage he's doing sometimes is despite his own incompetence. And the USAID the example of the Smithsonian is a great example, because the Smithsonian Institution, probably more than anything else, has been the arbiter of US history, particularly vis-a-vis Native Americans. And losing that taking them on, losing the power to set the discourse, he could have just been much more subtle and manipulative, and he's in some sense doing that has called attention.
Yeah.
You're saying it's made it an issue that people are debating, which you pointed out. And I said the same thing. We talked about USAID yesterday. U.S. food policy was developed by Truman as a non-military sort of neo-imperial way for the U.S. to have influence around the globe. Losing our, taking away USAID, good or bad, I'm not going to, is a huge reduction in U.S. power internationally. And if you look at Chinese foreign policy and business policy right now, especially, they are capitalizing on every stupid thing we're doing. They're now leading the world, 70% of solar infrastructure or power, machines, generators, and so forth are now built in China. Yeah. They're not stupid. I mean, they're looking at this and saying, wow, it's like Canada. The Canadian hotel industry experienced a boom during the first Trump administration because they started hosting all these conferences because people couldn't come to the U.S., right? So good for Canada. Well, you've got another set of problems, but yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I'm okay with going status. Okay, people like 5 minutes over. Sure. Okay. But we do have at least 4 questions in the room, so I'm hoping we could do rapid fire. Like Kyle, if you could ask your question, pass it off to Chris. Chris, once you're done, Bedros, you'll pick up, and then Ariel will swing it back to you, time permitting. If not, we can carry the conversation into lunch. So rapid fire, Kyle.
One cautionary note before I ask my question. With respect to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the governance of the museum is a 55-member board. 11 are recycled every year. They're presidential appointments. So it's a normal, it might not be, you can debate about the people being appointed, but it's a normal process. And I was frantically searching through email because I think that there's an explanation for the taking down of some of that material, because there's if my memory is right, there's a recycling of that exhibition that was pre-planned. So I would just caution to check that first. Anyway, my question, I got many questions, but I'll just do one for you, Amy. When you talked about the museums and memorial sites and centering the oppression of Blacks in the midst of the history, it sent me thinking about Holocaust museums. I'm more familiar with those. I've been to the African American Museum in Washington. It's fantastic, but I'm more familiar with the others, and I wonder about the pros and cons of centering the story on slavery in the way that Holocaust museums center the story on the Holocaust. But one of the effects of that is to kind of make that the whole story. And I'm thinking particularly about the Berlin Jewish Museum, which, yes, discusses Holocaust, but it's in the context of a much, much bigger story, as is the case in the African American Museum in Washington, which is it's an amazingly wonderful story that's being told there of progress and achievement, celebration of Black achievement. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I mean, I'll just say really quickly, that was part of why it took 100 years to create the Smithsonian Museum, because there were many African Americans who didn't want it to be a museum focused on slavery. And that's part of why most African American history museums don't have a big emphasis on slavery, and instead focus on progress. And that's where I see like the Montgomery Museum being really interesting, because it doesn't give you any uplift. It doesn't give you a break, and yet it is wildly popular. People love it. African Americans like go there on family reunions, go there on huge tours. I mean, it's really popular. And so I think I think it's a great question, and one that lots of people are grappling with. And I'm not kind of sure where where like the answer, if there is an answer.
Thank you. My question is also for Amy. This thing is weird. Really quickly, did you happen to go to the Museum Memorial Conference in Vienna in 2024?
No.
Okay.
No.
My question is about Austria, which is why I'm asking. So in 1991, Austria changed its narrative. It acknowledged its role in World War II. It stopped their victim sort of status, and they changed 1998. They, had legislation to repatriate art and to really acknowledge their role in World War II in their museums and such. And I've really been wondering, this administration notwithstanding, do you think there is a pathway for the U.S. to sort of to model that, to actually acknowledge our role in the genocide of Native Americans, acknowledge our role in the genocide of Black people through the function of slavery? Do you think there's a pathway for us to have Holocaust education in every state, not just particular states? I mean, these are all ways that other countries have successfully, at least on face value, acknowledged and tried to make reparations.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I mean, I think I and many other people thought in 2020 that we had hit a tipping point and that we would see some kind of real change. And the backlash has been so strong. I want to be optimistic and say yes at some point. And I see these kind of smaller grassroots projects and think there's potential, and they point toward the possibility. But it's hard to see, right? It's really hard. And especially right now, maybe if we get through this, this will be another tipping point. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Amy and Henry. Fascinating presentations. Amy, did you publish this talk? Is it published anywhere?
I like parts of it were part of just like a think piece on a
Okay, I think it should be, it needs to be published because as a teacher, I think understanding the attack on memory is much would be more impactful when they see the images and the changes that are taking place within the structures. As much as you bring text, etc., students are today, unfortunately, visual learners. So I think I would use this article for my students. That would be amazing, I think. So
Yeah, I've been working on, like right now, just trying to kind of follow what's happening and document it. But I think,
because the students only know about X monument that has been removed, and they think that that's specifically one case, and they don't understand the totality of the attack on memory and attack on monuments, so that's interesting. It was a comment, but I would like to have the article. Thank you, Amy.
And Lisa. We'll do one more. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. Something that I think you both kind of touched on, but especially you, Henry, kind of this combination of both denial, but also of almost this going back where people aren't necessarily seeing genocide as a problem in certain contexts. And so, like, what I'm thinking of in particular is how, and I mean, I'm Jewish, some people in my community, obviously not all, but have this sentiment of it's not a genocide, but if it was, it's justified. And so it's almost like this two-part step of where they're cognitively dissonant about what's going on while simultaneously recognizing that it might be going on, but like preparing to then be okay with that. And I think what I'm really struggling with is because that's something that we can see is being used not just Israel-Palestine, but in many different contexts now. And I think more than anything, it's an issue of people being in these silos where they have no context for the community that's being affected by that. And it's the type of thing where we do have an issue of empathy or apathy, where if someone isn't personally affected by something, it's very unlikely that they'll actually recognize the issue with that unless they have a secondhand or firsthand experience.
I'm glad you got to ask that question.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to start by saying it's, what's the quote? First they came for the trade unionists. Okay. That's I find that one of the worst possible ways of approaching human rights issues, because what it tells us is we only oppose things when it's in our self-interest, and it's a self-interest argument. It is in your self-interest to oppose. You know what? If they only came for the Jews in Europe and elsewhere, then we were all morally obligated to do that. It didn't matter if we were ever going to be targeted or not. And I think so. I think you've hit something really important, is that how do we get beyond a kind of emotional self-interest, whether it's that kind of thing or wanting to feel performatively like I'm a good person, so I say the right things, I do the right things, and that kind of stuff. And I think that's a challenge. I think talking about it and raising it as you did, I think is important. What you said about denial is very important. This denial and non-denial at the same point. Israel Charney, who is a pioneer in the discussion of genocide denial. What did I say? Is? Oh my gosh. Well, he is in the sense. Actually used to formulate that the problem of denial sometimes as that issue. It's like we didn't commit genocide, but we were right to do it, that kind of thing. And it looks like a contradiction, but I think if you look at his work, one of the things he says about denial is that it's actually a kind of I say tap dance. It's like a celebration of the genocide, because you have so much power, you can now deny it. You have absolute impunity. And so I think that sort of comes together. What we're seeing now, I think, might be a little bit different, and I see it more as a kind of postmodern fluidity, where people have gotten, it's like marketing strategies, whatever. If you remember years ago, like Che Guevara coffee table books were a big item, or X hats or whatever, and a lot of it was just marketing, right? Companies that were completely opposed to all the principles of Che Guevara were making money off of, histories of Che Guevara, things like that. And so I think that we see that particularly in capitalism, but in other cases, in other aspects of sort of liberalism and so forth, that there's such a fluidity. You embrace in the moment tactically what's useful. We see this all the time with the co-opting of different genocide stories to fit different kinds of narratives that other groups are trying to use. You know, like if you're a Holocaust denier, I remember one website, there was a Holocaust denial website that was saying the Cambodian genocide was true. Why? Because it's people of color against people of color. So I think we see a lot of those things that are just very opportunistic and very slippery. What's really difficult about dealing with that is I use the whack-a-mole thing. If I'm being more academic, a many-headed hydra, you cut off one head, but the denial or the genocidality just comes out somewhere else. And it's a big problem. So there's no solution, but you're raising great issues.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up because gone a couple minutes over. My apologies to the online audience. We had a very robust discussion in the room and did not get to the online questions, unfortunately, for this session. So I want to remind, well, I think something important to remember too is with both your presentations is the present, right? We're not just talking about the past, and monuments and memorialization tell us more about the present than the past, right? Like that context. And Kyle, I appreciated what you raised too, rather than focusing and reducing people to their trauma, right? Resiliency, celebration of culture and excellence. All that said, we're going to have, for the people in the room in person, we're going to have the Jewish Studies lunch in 4581?
Yeah, 4581.
4581, just down the hall. And if you happen to get lost on the way down the hall, we'll direct you. So, and for the online audience, we'll resume at 1 p.m. with the Armenian genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh and Bedros. We look forward to hearing from you then. Until then, see you at 1. Oh, yes, a round of applause for these amazing presentations that produce such a robust conversation. So thank you to both of you. Those are both really rich and engaging.